Mr. Speaker, what a load of bollocks that was in respect of targets. Well, he says we criticise those targets in the Labor Party. Well, we sure do, because here we've got the National Party out there again, sprinkling fairy dust, promising accountability in 2017 and not acknowledging any accountability until now for their failures on so many fronts. We have them saying, look, they're going to decrease violent crime by 20% by 2016 or 2017. We all want violent crime down. It's actually been going up. It's been going up in New Zealand under this government, and more particularly, overall crime has been going up in parts of Auckland, which are suffering the results most severely of the economic deprivation caused by this government's policies. And so for them to come along and say, oh look, we want violent crime to go down, and then say that that is a result. That's what Bill English said then. The results they announced earlier in the week were that they're going to have a target in 2016. That's a result under the National Party. What's missing from those targets while we're talking about these targets? Well, no targets around the sustainability of superannuation. Nothing. No target or milestone around closing the wage gap with Australia. Remember that promise? That the National Party in the 2008 election said they would close the wage gap with Australia. Have they? No. Have they agreed any milestone? No. Have they got any target in these better public service targets? No, they haven't. So they say that targets and milestones are important for accountability of the public service, but not if it affects them. They don't want accountability for the measures that they promised that they would achieve, because they know that they are failing to achieve them. So not just the wage gap with Australia, what about this promised step change in the economy? Well, the other thing I was surprised about in that speech we just had from Bill English, he virtually did not talk about the economy. At the end, he said, oh, look, there's problems in the world and therefore it's tough in New Zealand. Again, we all know that there's problems in the world. No one expects the government to magic away those problems. But 1,000 people a week for the last year haven't gone to Australia because of the problems in Greece. They've gone to Australia because of the problems in New Zealand. And those problems are not being addressed by the national government. Mr. Speaker, the budget does nothing to improve New Zealand's export performance. Nothing. Nothing at all to improve New Zealand's export performance. New Zealand has now run a current account deficit for every year in more than 3 decades. New Zealand's credit rating, which the National Party said would never drop under them, was dropped by Standard & Poor's and some of the other rating agencies last year because of our external liabilities, our net liabilities to the world, not the government's liabilities to the world, because the last Labor government ran budget surpluses and we reduced government debt to amongst the lowest in the world. And even now, after 4 years of this government, after the challenges of an earthquake, because Michael Cullen and Helen Clark and her then governments put money away in a time of plenty, budget surpluses that were opposed by Bill English and Don Brash and John Key, because the Labor Party did that. Even now, after 4 years of deficits under the national government, New Zealand still has low levels of government debt. But we have got high levels of private debt, and it gets worse from here. Every year you have a current account deficit. That deficit is bridged by either borrowing more money from overseas or selling your assets to overseas. And this government oversees both of those and has got no plan at all in this budget to turn it around. And as a consequence, we have Standard & Poor's saying that the biggest risk for New Zealand is our external deficit, the fact that the value of our exports do not cover the cost of our imports and our interest. And every year from here it gets worse. The Treasury has it going out to 6% of GDP, or 6.8% of GDP, I think it is, by 2016. The Reserve Bank say it's a problem. The OECD says it's a problem. The IMF says it's a problem. But the National Party ignores it. That's what this budget is. It's a zero ideas budget. in respect to the big issues. What are the other things have we had in this budget that are touched upon by the supplementary estimates? Larger class sizes. Larger class sizes is the way to improve educational outcomes, which we all...
But not for their kids.
No, not for their kids, that's right. In fact, the media disclosed the fact that a large proportion of the National Party cabinet ministers have their kids in private schools that sell their attributes to people on the basis of smaller class sizes than they can get in the state sector already. New Zealanders rebelled against that because they didn't like it. And now the government is trying to fool them by pulling their wool over their eyes that they don't need to address some of these difficult issues like our export performance, like the age of eligibility for superannuation, like our need to save more through improvements to the KiwiSaver scheme, like some more investment into the export sector by introducing a capital gains tax so that people invest in businesses on the basis of the profitability of those businesses rather than the tax bias that currently favours investment in property to the detriment of our export sector. Those are the sorts of measures that we ought to be debating today, but we don't hear one word of them from the Minister of Finance. We have these pixie dust, rainbow at the end of every street's promised by National, but no rate to get there. Even their objective in respect of benefit, number of people dependent on working age benefits, has as its target a higher figure than it was when they took office. Isn't that abject failure? We had Bill English saying that we did nothing to reduce long-term benefit dependency. We actually had New Zealand's unemployment down to the lowest in the world. There were about 2 years when we swapped with South Korea, where South Korea and New Zealand had the lowest rate of unemployment in the year. We had domestic purposes benefits down as well. We had the DPB numbers down as well. We had crime dropping across the country in no small part because we had a buoyant economy. People had hope in their lives and they were adhering to the social mores of our country because they had a sense of hope and participation in our community. And when you have increasing numbers of people who don't have hope, then they ignore the rules in society more often, and it's no excuse from my perspective, but it is a reality that when you have poor economic performance, you have increasing crime rates. And Bill English denies that, as his predecessor did in prior national governments, but whenever you have the economy going better, you do also get drops in the rate of crime. Mr. Speaker, growth in the economy, growth in jobs, growth in exports and growth in income is what we needed from this budget, and we haven't got any of them. This budget forecasts very, very mediocre growth. Very mediocre growth. Even since the global financial crisis, outside of Europe, average growth rates have been far higher than we've achieved in New Zealand. That's despite the fact that our two largest trading partners, Australia and China, have been the most prosperous economies in the world. And yet New Zealand has been in the doldrums, and this budget does not show any advance upon it. I think it says a lot about the national government that the biggest part of their economic agenda this 3 years is to change who owns what already exists. That's what's happening with these SOE sales. That's the biggest part of their economic plan. Not only does it increase the government deficit by $100 million per annum, not only does it increase our current account deficit overseas, not only does it increase power prices to domestic consumers, these asset sales disclose how empty the cupboard is when it comes to important economic changes being brought about by this government. The central part of their economic plan for this 3 years is to sell off those SOEs. And we know on this side of the House that changing who owns what already exists does nothing to improve our economy. We don't get any more exports out of it. We don't get any more jobs out of it. We don't get any more economic growth out of it. What we do get is more inequality. National Party oversees inequality very well every time they're in power. We see a move of assets and income to the higher income people at the expense of the middle classes and lower income people. We've seen it in prior budgets from this government where 40% of their income tax cuts went to the top 10%, and it's those top 10% of income earners, the wealthiest people in society, who will be disproportionately buying these shares, and we will see inequality in New Zealand increase as a consequence. So this government continues to throw out these little targets, throw diversions. We've had...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired. I call Materia to...